Thank you so much for downloading this webinar. I'm so happy that you're here, and I'm so excited that you want to learn more about the research on intuitive eating and disordered eating. So this is a webinar that I actually gave when I was a dietetic intern, and in the webinar I'm presenting on Orthorexia Nervosa, which is a form of disordered eating that results from an unhealthy obsession with health. And then I talk about intuitive eating as an intervention for orthorexia nervosa. So this was a webinar given to mostly other dietitians and dietetic interns, but I find the research to be fascinating, and I think that you will too. So a few quick notes. I cut out one of the studies, so you'll see that it goes like study 1 to skips over 3 and then 4 and 5. I just felt like it wasn't as relevant for what you might be here for, so there's that. And another thing I want to mention is that I talk about orthorexia nervosa, which you're going to learn all about in the webinar. That is like the extreme unhealthy obsession with health. But what I want you to keep in mind is, even if you're not there, if you're having these disordered thoughts about food, this presentation is really going to be informative for you to see just how those thoughts could really cause negative physiological effects and could become so problematic for your life. So just because you wouldn't characterize yourself as having that eating disorder doesn't mean that you can't still learn something from this presentation. And in the second half of the presentation, I really go into intuitive eating and what the research says about it. So, a lot of people are like, okay, cool, diets don't work and intuitive eating is the answer. Why should I believe you? And you know what? They're totally right. You should definitely be skeptical, and you should always look for the science. So I'm happy to get to present some of the science to you. And I really hope you enjoy this. Again, thank you for being here. If you have any questions, you can always hit reply to this email. I answer every email, or you can DM me, whatever works. I love chatting about this stuff, and I hope you learned something. Thank you for coming to my presentation today. My name is Leah Kern, and I'm going to be presenting on the intersection of orthorexia nervosa and intuitive eating. So just a little background about me. As Christina said, I'm a New York City Region 3 intern. I graduated from the University of Vermont with my Bachelor's of Dietetics last May, and I started my internship immediately in September. My first rotation was at a Sodexo account in Manhattan, a French called Société Générale, and then I did my wellness with a private practice dietitian in Manhattan, Sammy Brando. And I completed most of my community hours with a integrative dietitian who integrates cannabis and into dietetics, and she was out of Hoboken, New Jersey. That's Laura Logano. And I was in the middle of completing my clinical at Jamaica Hospital prior to everything that's going on with COVID-19, and I hope to return there eventually. So the objectives for today's presentation: at the conclusion of this presentation, participants will be able to define orthorexia nervosa and its symptoms, define intuitive eating behaviors, recognize factors contributing to increasing prevalence of orthorexia, and define why intuitive eating functions as an intervention for orthorexia. How this presentation is going to go, it's going to be split into 2 parts. The first half is about orthorexia. I'll introduce and define orthorexia and then review studies on orthorexia. And then I will summarize the problems that orthorexia presents. And then in the second half of the presentation, I will introduce and define intuitive eating, and then review the studies on intuitive eating, and finally examine intuitive eating as an intervention for orthorexia. So a little bit about why I chose this topic. Orthorexia nervosa and intuitive eating are topics of increasing interest in the literature in the dietetics field. So this graph on the right shows articles published on orthorexia from 2002 to 2017, and we can see that number is increasing very quickly, and according to this trend it will probably continue to increase. So there are various studies on orthorexia and intuitive eating respectively, but there are fewer studies on how they might be connected, and in this presentation I'm proposing that they definitely are connected. So I wanted to create this presentation to address the gap between an emerging disorder and an emerging intervention, and to review the research, because as dietitians it's important to stay on top of
the most current research, and clearly this is something that's increasing in interest and in academic studies. What is orthorexia? Dietitians devote their careers to educating, counseling, and researching optimal eating patterns to promote well-being and prevent lifestyle-related diseases. So it might come as a surprise to some that a dietitian would actually caution against eating too healthy. Orthorexia is ultimately the problem that results from eating too healthy. So we can see here in the bullets that orthorexia is characterized by a pathological fixation on healthy eating. There's discrepancy involving the exact prevalence of orthorexia, and that's because it's not an official eating disorder. This is only because it's not formally recognized by the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is a collection of psychological disorders. And the reason it's not in the DSM yet is because it's unclear exactly where it fits in, whether it's classified, if it should be classified as a subset of another eating disorder, if it's a part of OCD. It's hard to say at this point where it falls, and that's why it's not officially recognized. However, it is recognized by the National Eating Disorder Association, and that definition is below. And what I want to highlight is this eating disorder is different than the other ones that the public might be more familiar with, such as anorexia nervosa and bulimia. And that's because it has less of a stigma in a way, because anorexia nervosa is characterized by lack of calories, avoiding food altogether. Bulimia is characterized by consuming food but purging in some way. And orthorexia is different because it's characterized as an unhealthy obsession with health. It tends to be more easily hidden and more socially acceptable. You know, people might just say that person's just healthy, and they might not be as quick to understand it as an actual eating disorder. But the reality is that it's still serious because there are clinical and psychological impairments that can result from orthorexia, and that's what we're going to look at in this presentation. Just a little bit of the history. I thought it was important to give some context. It was coined in 1997 by an alternative medicine practitioner, Stephen Bratman, and he didn't intend to create a new eating disorder. It was happening from his experiences. His clients, he was seeing many clients who were overly obsessed about health. And as an alternative medicine practitioner, he really believed in treating the whole person. So he was seeing, okay, these people might have had an initially their motivation was good to get healthy, but he was seeing the unintended negative consequences. So he consulted a Greek scholar to come up with the term orthorexia, which is a combination of the words ortho, meaning correct, and orexis, meaning diet or appetite. And on the bottom, we see his definition, which I've highlighted. The key point is that people with orthorexia have overvalued ideas about the healthy promoting and health damaging properties in food. We're going to get right into the studies. The first study is Orthorexia Nervosa, a psychological review of risk factors. The background of the study. The purpose is to report findings on the psychosocial risk factors associated with orthorexia nervosa and determine the nature of its underlying psychopathology. So this is a systemic review. It was published in 2019. To be included in this systemic review, the papers must be peer-reviewed, the results must report from primary resources, and they must include examination of psychosocial risk factors. And it's important to note that psychosocial is defined as any psychological or social variable that made an individual more likely to develop orthorexia. Here we can see initially there were 179 studies identified. After screening for eligibility and inclusion criteria, there were 54 studies that qualified to be in this systemic review. And on the right, we can see the data that was extracted from each of the 54 studies. All of these studies went through the American Dietetic Association quality criteria checklist. This slide is showing us all the different assessment tools used throughout the studies to assess orthorexia nervosa. And as I mentioned in an earlier slide, orthorexia is not officially recognized as an eating disorder. And that's largely because there is no official diagnostic test. So as a result, we have various different tests emerging from different professionals who are trying to create the best test to assess orthorexia. So these are all the tests that were used. So there were mixed findings or no significant correlations with the following factors: age, gender, veganism or vegetarianism, social media use, and body image. So in other words, these factors were not found to lead to increased risk of orthorexia. However, the factors on the right in orange were found to be significantly correlated with orthorexia nervosa. These factors are higher education level, higher socioeconomic status, perfectionism and OCD, pre-existing psychopathology like anxiety and depression, thin idealized internalization, history of dieting, and history of an eating disorder. So here we see essentially the results of the systemic review illustrated. So the outer box illustrates and lists the social and cultural factors that appear to contribute to orthorexia. The smaller box illustrates the psychological factors that the study found to contribute to orthorexia. So something I want to point out is in the social factors in the larger box, we see that higher education and higher socioeconomic status are factors that contribute to orthorexia nervosa. And I just thought this was interesting because there appears to be an element of privilege that is associated with this eating disorder. It seems to disproportionately affect people of privilege. It takes time and money ultimately to obsess over health and health foods, and of course time and money to acquire healthy foods. So in many cases, this is a disorder that seems to be affecting people of higher socioeconomic status, which is something to keep in mind when working within different demographics. So the limitations of this study. So as I mentioned earlier, the Ortho15 test was used in a majority of the studies. However, it has the lowest internal reliability of only 0.33. So that's a major limitation of this test. Additionally, the Ortho15 has the ability to test participants for healthy eating behaviors. However, it lacks the sensitivity to detect clinical or psychological social impairment as a result of the healthy eating behaviors. So this results in false positives and a high prevalence, which is likely not accurate. So another limitation overall is, as I mentioned, there are various research assessments being used to measure orthorexia, so there's a lack of standard diagnostic tests, which makes it more difficult to compare between studies. However, a major strength of this study is that we can see that we're moving in the right direction. Ortho15, though it has a low internal reliability and it doesn't assess clinical impairment, as a result of these shortcomings, the EHQ, which is another test, was developed, which does include a subscale that measures impairment due to healthy eating. However, the EHQ has shortcomings of its own, which is that it lacks the criteria to assess guilt and sadness and self-punishment as a result of healthy eating behaviors. As a result, the TOS was created, which was only used in one study, but it does assess negative emotions, self-punishment, and social impairment caused by ON. So we can see here that we are moving in the right direction, and orthorexia is still a very new topic that is just gaining recognition in the literature. So we can see that the tests are being refined. So strengths and future research. This systemic review does acknowledge limitations of the different assessment measures via the internal reliability tests. So that's a major strength. It does illustrate emerging stronger ON assessment tools being developed in response to the limitations of current tests, which we saw on the last slide. It gives healthcare practitioners insight into the potential risk factors for orthorexia. And finally, it proposes the underlying psychopathology for orthorexia. Future research should use these improved assessment measures for more reliable results, so the measures with higher internal reliability. And future systemic reviews should exclusively evaluate studies using assessment tools with higher internal reliability and exclude the Ortho15 assessment unless it is amended to include a subscale that can detect clinical impairment. So that brings us to the second study, Instagram use linked to increased symptoms of orthorexia nervosa. So the background of the study. The purpose is to investigate the link between social media use, in particular Instagram, and orthorexia nervosa symptoms. Participants were recruited via a non-paid ad on social media and the ad was also on 2 healthy blogging communities. So the assessment measures used to measure orthorexia, the Ortho 15 test was used, which we saw in the last study, has problems of its own, and we will get into that. And to measure time on social media, it was a self-reported minutes per week. So the data from this study, 713 participants were surveyed, 686 female, 27 non-female. Because there were so few non-female, the people conducting the survey decided to exclude them because there were not enough to be significant. As a result, the final sample is 680 participants, all female. Information that was obtained in the survey is the participants' Ortho 15 score, their social media use, both the channels and the time, their dietary choices, and demographics like age, BMI, country, and ethnicity. So Instagram, as you can see here in the orange box, was found to be the most used channel and among the participants, and also they spent the greatest amount of time on this channel. So the results of this study. Well, from the study, we have this graph which illustrates the negative relationship between time spent on Instagram and Ortho 15 scores in minutes per week. In other words, as time spent on Instagram increases, Ortho 15 score decreases. And just a reminder, the lower the Ortho 15 score, the greater the symptoms of orthorexia nervosa. So here we see that the correlation between time spent on social media and Ortho 15 was significant. We see the 2 asterisks next to Instagram, which signifies a p-value of less than 0.01, which was found to be significant in this study. So we can say that as Instagram use increases, ON score decreases, lower ON score, more ON symptoms present. The limitations of this study. Firstly, only women participants were analyzed, so the results are not generalizable. And the use of a survey to determine the results is also a limitation because it can lead to inaccurate data, as people often falsely self-report, especially when asked sensitive information like BMI and eating habits. Another limitation is that the Ortho 15 was the assessment tool used to measure orthorexia nervosa, and as we saw in the first study, this assessment measure has problems of its own, and it's previously shown to result in false positives for ON. Finally, non-random sampling was used. The research title was Health Habits on Social Media. This is the title of the survey link. So this may have disproportionately attracted people who already had an interest in health rather than a varied participant base. Strengths and applications for RDs. Instagram use is growing in prevalence. There are currently over 500 million users, and that number is probably already greater than the time that I did this research. So as Instagram use increases, we can predict that orthorexia might increase in response. Now, RDs should use this information to get ahead of the curve and address orthorexia. The ability to follow others appears to contribute to this doctrination of stringent food rules. Now, this may have something to do with influencer and celebrity culture. Perhaps if someone sees someone who they admire on social media who has no education on dietetics or nutrition, giving advice on what to eat, they might just blindly follow them just because they have a liking for that person. So it's really the responsibility of RGs to put evidence-based info on social media to combat this culture. Future research should focus on determining the causal link, as the study is still only correlational. So other issues with orthorexia nervosa. There are 2 other issues that I want to touch on before moving forward to talk about intuitive eating, and that is orthorexia can result in social isolation, and here's how that happens. Social settings often involve food. We all have experienced that. So people suffering from orthorexia nervosa tend to avoid social settings to maintain control over their strict diet. As a result, they end up in situations of social isolation. And we know that social interaction is well documented to be a factor contributing to mental health, to positive mental health. So that's just another example of how the initially positive motivation with trying to have a healthy diet can result in an unintended negative consequence. Now, the other thing that can happen is actually increased inflammation. And the way that happens is food is a trigger for anxiety in people with orthorexia nervosa. Now, the problem is they're constantly exposed to food. Food is everywhere. Most people eat every day. So as a result, they experience prolonged exposure to anxiety, which leads to increased biomarkers for inflammation, such as C-reactive protein and cytokines. Now, the irony of ON really starts to reveal itself here. We can see that in pursuit of health, people with ON develop a kind of tunnel vision for dietary health that completely ignores other equally as important aspects of health, such as emotional well-being. So between increased inflammation, micronutrient deficiencies, social isolation, increased risk for malnutrition, decreased ability to focus on daily tasks, and increased anxiety, we can see that obsessing over a healthy diet doesn't seem so healthy after all. So the question is, what is the optimal way to eat and live? If being an enthusiastic follower of a healthy diet can turn unhealthy, then what are we supposed to recommend people? So that's where intuitive eating comes in. The research is suggesting that intuitive eating could be a viable intervention for people experiencing complex relationships with food. Intuitive eating was coined by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Reich in 1995 when they wrote this book. It emphasizes attention to innate hunger and satiety cues. It's all about honoring hunger and rejecting diet mentality, and it's emerging in the dietetics field as a topic of increasing interest in research studies. So why is intuitive eating becoming so popular? Well, the public is very clearly inundated with endless diets claiming to have the fix, have the answer. So the research shows restriction from dieting does not work. People are seeking a new way. They're turning to intuitive eating after years of dieting, and after realizing that dieting is really only a short-term approach when intuitive eating offers a more sustainable approach. And this quote at the bottom, I think, just summarizes perfectly what we already know to be true, and that's that diets do not result in weight loss long-term. It's despite the growing popularity of fad diets and exercise plans for weight loss, there are limited studies that actually suggest these particular regimens are beneficial and lead to long-term weight loss. So before we get into the studies on intuitive eating, I just wanted to show how intuitive eating and orthorexia nervosa exists on different sides of the same spectrum. Intuitive eating is ultimately about rejecting the diet mentality, and orthorexia, though it's not a traditional diet like, say, keto or paleo, it is a diet in the sense that it involves strictly following self-imposed food rules. Therefore, it's really about assuming a diet mentality, and it has the same effect. And so this chart shows how a person with orthorexia experiences various factors leading to decreased quality of life, while the intuitive eater relates to food in a much more positive, healthy, sustainable way. So the fourth study we're going to look at, and the first study on intuitive eating, is a structured literature review of the role of mindfulness, mindful eating, and intuitive eating in changing eating behaviors. So the purpose of this study is to examine the outcomes of mindful eating and intuitive eating in changing eating behaviors. Now, it's a literature review published in 2017 in Nutrition Research Reviews and Journals. There were 18 different databases used, and mindful eating and intuitive eating were used interchangeably, essentially. And mindful eating and intuitive eating are often used interchangeably, as both emphasize connecting to interoceptive signals. Intuitive eating is essentially just a more specific subset of mindful eating, coined by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Reich in their book, but it encompasses the same concepts. So there's many search terms. I just highlighted some that are relevant to my topic. So here we can see the search yielded 99 papers. After screening for inclusion criteria, there were 68 papers that could be included, 23 of which were interventional studies in overweight and obese populations, 29 were intervention studies in normal weight populations, and 16 were observational studies. This slide shows the assessment tools used. So there were 4 different assessment tools used. The first one is the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire. This is a 39-item questionnaire, and it measures traits across the subscales that are observing, describing, acting with awareness, non-judgment of inner experience, and non-reactivity to inner experience, with a high internal reliability of 0.87. Mindfulness Awareness Attention Scale is a 15-item, 6-point Likert type scale, measures levels of day-to-day awareness, attention, and observation. And it also has a high internal reliability of 0.82. The Mindful Eating Questionnaire is a 28-item questionnaire. It assesses 5 domains: disinhibition, awareness, external cues, emotional response, and distraction. It also uses a 4-point Likert type scale with a internal reliability that is somewhere between 0.7 and 0.9. There's varying thoughts on what the internal reliability is. Finally, the Intuitive Eating Scale, which is a 21-item scale questionnaire that assesses each item on a 5-point Likert type scale. It measures readiness to eat in response to internal cues and trust of these cues. It also measures eating for physical and not emotional reasons with an internal reliability greater than 0.7. So it's important to note that all of these assessment tools have high internal reliabilities, all greater than 0.7, which is considered a strong internal reliability according to Cronbach's alpha score. This is the intervention and observational study results. Results were all coded and summarized with the following codes. A positive code indicates the outcome demonstrated a beneficial effect of mindfulness or intuitive eating. A neutral code indicated that the intervention had no significant effect. A negative code indicates the outcome demonstrated a harmful effect. And mixed code indicates the outcome demonstrated some positive and some neutral outcomes. So, interventional study results. Mindfulness and intuitive eating intervention showed beneficial effects on weight, binge eating, emotional eating, eating attitudes, cravings, hunger awareness, and body dissatisfaction. The results of the observational study. Of the 16 observational studied, they were all on intuitive eating, and the results were unanimously positive, demonstrating that IE appears to have a beneficial impact on eating behaviors. Though all of these effects were positive, 2 effects that are of particular interest as benefits to those recovering from orthorexia are the ones that have boxes around them: intuitive eating and observing hunger cues, and intuitive eating and interoceptive sensitivity, which is essentially the ability to describe and to be in touch with what's happening inside of you. Strengths and limitations. So strengths of the study, it uses a mix of observational and interventional studies, and also it assesses behaviors using assessments with strong internal reliability. Limitations: there's lack of a universal assessment tool for intuitive eating and mindfulness, so it makes comparing across studies difficult. Additionally, there is a relatively small sample size. So application and future research. As I mentioned earlier, intuitive eating was found to lead to better interoceptive sensitivity and better ability to detect hunger and satiety cues. Now, this is really crucial for people experiencing orthorexia, because people with orthorexia often lose touch with the ability to determine hunger and fullness. They don't even know what it feels like anymore. And this is the case with many eating disorders. And it happens because after governing your eating behaviors by an outside set of rules for so long, you lose the ability to actually hear what your body is saying. And so according to this study, intuitive eating provides the framework to help individuals reestablish this interoceptive sensitivity, which is a remarkable benefit for people struggling from eating disorders like orthorexia. So RDs can implement mindfulness and intuitive eating practices as an intervention for patients with complex relationships with food. And future research should focus on intuitive eating and orthorexia specifically. Development of official orthorexia criteria, again, as a theme of this presentation, will help to further the research. Finally, the last study is changes in intuitive eating and orthorexia scores among female graduate students in dietetics. So the purpose of the study, it's a very simple study. It's evaluating the difference between new and long-term female graduate dietetic students regarding their eating and body-related attitudes, beliefs, and patterns. So it was an observational study in 2015, and it was published in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So it uses a survey consisting of several validated instruments to evaluate dietary intake, physical activity, body image, intuitive eating, depression, and perceived stress. T-tests were used to analyze the data, and there were two groups used: new dietetic students and long-term dietetic students. New dietetic students being undergrad, freshmen, and long-term students being master's students. And the survey was given both at baseline and at the end of the academic year. So the results: data collected from 31 participants, 17 new students, 14 long-term students. And the results were that the intuitive eating scale, total scores, and unconditional permission to eat subscales were significantly higher among long-term students than new students. And also long-term students had significantly lower orthorexia scores compared to new students. And this means that essentially the newer students had more instances of orthorexia, whereas the more long-term students demonstrated more intuitive eating behaviors. So what that study tells us is that evidence-based education has a pretty profound effect on intuitive eating and orthorexia. It seems to increase intuitive eating behaviors and decrease orthorexia symptoms. And that's a pretty remarkable results, considering we're in an evidence-based field and there's lots of emphasis on the power of evidence-based knowledge. So a strength is that we do get insights showing the value of nutrition education. A limitation is we don't have information about the specific validated instruments used, and it was a small sample size of only women. So application and future research. Nutrition education appears to lead to increased IE behaviors and decreased ON. The study shows the value of evidence-based education. So RD should focus on equipping patients and clients with this evidence-based knowledge. And evidence-based education from RDs is crucial to dispel the misinformation that a person with orthorexia has adopted from the media or elsewhere. Now, future research should really focus on looking at this, the impact of evidence-based education on the general public. It's unrealistic to prescribe everyone a master's education in dietetics, so we need to see how nutrition education is affecting people at the population level. Now, the takeaways from this presentation are that there are various risk factors for orthorexia that RDs should be aware of. Patients exhibiting orthorexia symptoms appear to be at increased risk for malnutrition, which is an important clinical implication. And as social media use continues to increase, orthorexia will likely increase in prevalence, so RDs should be prepared. Intuitive eating enhances the ability to detect hunger and satiety cues, which is an ability that is lost in patients with eating disorders like orthorexia. Therefore, it presents itself as a very viable intervention for people with orthorexia. Evidence-based nutrition education was found to decrease orthorexia symptoms and increase intuitive eating behaviors. These are my references, and thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has at this point.